When people talk about the neighbor from hell, they usually mean someone who lets their dog bark too much, or someone who never trims their hedges. But in my neighborhood, the term had a face, a name, and a power-hungry grip on every aspect of community life. Her name was Karen Mitchell. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed ruler of the Homeowners Association, the kind of person who believed her clipboard gave her more authority than the state itself. For years, Karen had controlled every decision in the neighborhood. What color your shutters could be, what type of flowers you were allowed to plant, and even how many cars could be parked in your own driveway. Most of the neighbors gave in to her demands because fighting her was exhausting. But for me, things were different. I wasn't just another resident. I was a retired Army mechanic who'd spent 2 decades fixing machines in war zones and teaching young recruits how to survive under pressure. And more importantly, I was the father of a boy who'd already faced more battles in his young life than most people could imagine. My son, Daniel, was 17 years old and had been in a wheelchair since he was 11. A rare medical condition had left him unable to walk, but it hadn't taken his spirit. If anything, it gave him a fire that few people his age carried. He loved machines, especially motorcycles. He couldn't ride one, at least not in the traditional sense, but he loved to be around them. He would spend hours in the garage with me, helping to clean, repair, and tune the bikes that rolled through. For him, it wasn't just a hobby. It was a way of life, a connection to me and a taste of freedom that his condition had tried to steal. Of course, Karen hated it. She hated the sound of tools, the sight of bikes in the driveway, and the way other bikers would occasionally swing by to visit. In her mind, a motorcycle was a symbol of chaos, rebellion, and everything she believed didn't belong in her pristine, cookie-cutter suburb. To her, our garage was an eyesore, a disruption, and, worst of all, something she couldn't control. At first, her complaints were passive-aggressive. She'd send letters about noise disturbances that were nothing more than Daniel and I laughing while working. She fined us for having non-compliant equipment visible from the street, referring to the motorcycle covers in the driveway. Then she moved on to personal comments, the kind that cut deeper than any official notice. She once told Daniel within my hearing that boys like him shouldn't be tinkering with dangerous machines. He never showed her how much it hurt. But when he rolled back into the garage that evening, I could see it in his eyes. That was the first time I realized Karen wasn't just a nuisance. She was a bully, and bullies, in my experience, always push until someone pushes back. The breaking point came one weekend in late spring. Daniel and I had been working on a friend's bike, an old Harley that needed a carburetor adjustment. It was a sunny Saturday, and for the first time in a while, my son was smiling ear to ear. His hands were smudged with grease, his wheelchair tray cluttered with tools, and he looked more alive than he had in weeks. That's when Karen marched over, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her face like she was inspecting a military unit. She didn't even glance at Daniel before launching into her tirade. According to her, our garage violated community standards by functioning as a commercial repair shop. She claimed neighbors were complaining about gang members loitering in the cul-de-sac. And then, with her signature smug smile, she told me she had friends who could take care of the problem. I brushed her off, but Daniel heard every word. That night, after the tools were put away and the garage was dark, he asked me if Karen really meant it. I told him not to worry, but deep down I knew Karen wasn't the type to bluff. A few days later, I found out I was right. It started with the sound of engines, 15 of them, rolling into our neighborhood like a storm. They weren't the friendly riders we knew. These were patched members of the Hells Angels, their presence impossible to miss. They parked in a line outside our house, their bikes gleaming under the streetlights, their expressions cold and unfriendly. Neighbors peeked through blinds, phones pressed to their ears, but no one dared step outside. Daniel was in the garage when they arrived. He froze, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his eyes wide with fear. One of the bikers revved his engine, the sound echoing through the cul-de-sac like a threat. Another leaned on his handlebars, staring directly at my son. They didn't say a word. But their message was clear. We weren't welcome here, and if we didn't stop, things would get worse. Karen watched the whole thing from across the street. A satisfied smirk plastered across her face. She thought she'd won. She thought bringing in 15 members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in the world would scare us into submission. What she didn't know was that she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't confront the bikers. I didn't yell, threaten, or escalate. Instead, I pulled out my phone and recorded everything. Every rev of the engine, every glare, every second of Karen's smug expression as she leaned against her porch railing, sipping from her wine glass like she was the queen of the neighborhood. The bikers eventually rode off, leaving tire marks on the asphalt and a chill in the air. Daniel didn't say anything for the rest of the night. He just sat quietly staring at the floor, his earlier joy replaced by fear. For me, that silence was worse than any threat. Karen thought she'd scared us. What she didn't realize was that she'd lit a fire. Because if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's this. When you threaten my family, you don't just pick a fight with me. You pick a fight with everyone who stands with us, and in my world, that's a lot of people. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed, I sat alone in the garage. The tools were still scattered, the smell of oil still fresh, but the room felt different. It wasn't just a workshop anymore. It was a battlefield, and Karen had just declared war. What she didn't know was that while she had 15 bikers at her disposal, I had something far more powerful: loyalty. Old friends, brothers in arms, men and women who didn't need a paycheck or a threat to stand beside me. All it would take was one call, and Karen would see exactly what kind of storm she'd unleashed. For now, though, I stayed quiet. I let Karen enjoy her false victory, let her believe she'd put me in my place. Because sometimes the best way to win a fight is to let your enemy think they've won, right up until the moment you strike back. And as I turned off the garage light and closed the door that night, I made a silent promise. Karen may have brought 15 bikes to my house, but soon she'd learn what it meant when 100 showed up at hers. The night the Hells Angels rolled away, leaving behind their tire tracks and intimidation, I sat in silence long after the engines had faded. The street was quiet again, but it wasn't the kind of peace that settles the soul. It was the eerie silence after a storm, when you know the air still holds static, when you can still taste the charge of something unfinished. Karen thought she'd won a decisive battle. She believed she had shown me the weight of her influence, that by unleashing 15 bikers at my doorstep, she had secured her dominance over me, my son, and the little garage that meant everything to us. But intimidation has a short shelf life. Fear burns hot, but it burns out quickly, and once the smoke clears, all that's left is resolve. That night I looked at my son, and I knew Karen had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The next morning, Daniel was quieter than usual. Normally, even if he didn't have much energy, he'd want to be in the garage. He'd roll himself out there, sit among the bikes, and talk to me about what project we should start next. But that morning, he didn't ask. He sat at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around in his bowl, his gaze distant. The roar of engines from the night before was still rattling inside him. Karen hadn't just sent bikers to our home. She had invaded his sanctuary, poisoned the one place he felt safe. That realization hit me harder than anything else. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about my son. Karen had weaponized fear against a kid in a wheelchair, and that was something I couldn't forgive. I knew Karen well enough to understand her playbook. She thrived on control, and she craved an audience. Sending bikers was just her opening move. She wanted the neighborhood to see me humiliated, isolated, and beaten down, and she wasn't going to stop there. Sure enough, within 48 hours, the HOA notices started showing up. They came in waves, paper after paper, stuffed into my mailbox and taped to my front door. One claimed that my garage was functioning as a commercial business without approval. Another fined me $500 for unsightly vehicles visible from the street, referring to the motorcycles parked in my driveway. A third warned that if I continued to violate community standards, legal action would be taken. It was all textbook Karen. She was laying the groundwork for a full assault, building a case against me so she could drive me out of the neighborhood entirely, and the lies didn't stop with paperwork. Soon whispers started spreading among the neighbors. I'd catch fragments of conversation when I walked outside. I heard he's running a chop shop. Karen said bikers are dealing drugs out of his garage. That poor boy shouldn't be around that kind of environment. Karen's propaganda machine was running at full speed, and like most lies, it didn't take much for people to believe it. After all, it was easier to nod along with Karen than to question her authority, but what Karen didn't count on was my patience. I'd spent 20 years in the military. I'd been stationed in places where rumors were weapons, where misinformation could be as deadly as bullets. I knew how to handle intimidation, and I knew how to turn the tide of perception. I started documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every rumor that reached my ears. I had a binder on the kitchen counter that was quickly filling up with evidence. And every night after Daniel went to bed, I would scroll through the footage on my phone, recordings of the Hells Angels revving engines outside my garage, Karen watching with satisfaction from across the street. I wasn't just collecting proof for myself. I was building a case, brick by brick, preparing for the day when I'd lay it all out in the open. Meanwhile, Karen continued her campaign. She strutted around the neighborhood with renewed arrogance, boasting about how she had cleaned up the street. She even hinted that the bikers might return if I didn't learn my lesson. She spoke loudly enough that I could hear her from my own front yard. Every word was a taunt, meant to remind me that she was the queen bee, and I was just another drone in her hive. But there was something Karen didn't know, something she could never have imagined. When I left the military, I didn't leave my connections behind. Over the years, I had made friends in all kinds of places: mechanics, veterans, riders, and yes, bikers. Some of those friends had joined clubs, some had gone independent, but all of them shared one thing in common: loyalty. And loyalty doesn't fade with time. So while Karen tightened her grip on the HOA, I started making quiet moves of my own. Late at night, with the garage door closed and the lights dim, I pulled out my old contacts list, names I hadn't called in years. Men and women who owed me favors, and some who didn't owe me anything at all but would answer the call simply because that's what brothers do. I didn't tell Daniel what I was doing. He was already carrying too much weight. But when he asked me why I seemed calmer than usual, why I wasn't lashing out at Karen the way she expected, I told him the truth in simple terms. Sometimes the best way to fight back is to let your enemy think they're winning. The truth was, Karen wasn't winning. She was writing her own downfall with every smug smile, every notice, every biker she sent my way. She thought intimidation was her weapon. What she didn't realize was that it was mine too, but not in the way she imagined, because intimidation can work both ways. And soon she was about to see exactly what it looked like when the tables turned. The first sign of change came on a Sunday afternoon. Karen was hosting one of her infamous HOA meetings at her house, the kind where attendance was mandatory if you didn't want your lawn cited for non-compliance. I didn't go. Instead, I sat in my garage with the door open, polishing chrome on one of the Harleys. Daniel sat beside me, tools scattered on his tray, pretending to be focused but still haunted by the memory of those 15 engines roaring in his face. That's when we heard it, faint at first, like the hum of distant thunder. The low, steady rumble of engines, not 15 this time, but dozens. Daniel's head snapped up, eyes wide, but instead of fear, I saw something else flicker in his gaze: hope. The sound grew louder, rolling through the neighborhood like a tide. Neighbors peeked out their windows again, just like they had the night Karen's bikers came. But this time the energy was different. The rumble wasn't menacing. It was steady, controlled, purposeful. One by one, bikes began pulling into our cul-de-sac. Not patched Hells Angels this time, but riders of all stripes, veterans, independents, even a few old friends I hadn't seen in years. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. They parked their bikes along the curb, forming a protective wall around my house. Engines idled, chrome gleamed in the sun, and the air vibrated with solidarity. Karen came storming out of her house, her HOA meeting forgotten, her face twisted in disbelief. This wasn't her plan. This wasn't her script. She had expected us to crumble, to give up and leave quietly. Instead, she was staring at 100 bikes filling the street, 100 riders standing shoulder to shoulder with the boy she had tried to break. And as I stood there, Daniel beside me watching Karen's empire of intimidation collapse before her eyes. I knew one thing for certain. The real fight had just begun. The rumble of engines faded only after the last of the riders had left the cul-de-sac that Sunday. But even as silence returned to the neighborhood, the memory of that day hung thick in the air. For Daniel, it was the first time since Karen's attack that I saw a spark of light come back into his eyes. He had gone from fear to awe, from shrinking in his chair to straightening with pride. To him, the sight of those bikes wasn't just noise and chrome. It was proof that he wasn't alone, that people cared enough to show up for him, even when they had nothing to gain. Karen, however, saw something very different. To her, it was an open challenge to her authority, a slap in the face to her carefully constructed empire. She didn't see solidarity, she saw rebellion. And if there was one thing Karen couldn't tolerate, it was losing control. The morning after the riders gathered, Karen was already on the offensive. Fresh notices appeared in my mailbox, this time claiming that my property was being used for unauthorized assemblies. She accused me of orchestrating a public disturbance, complete with fines stacked so high they might have bankrupted anyone else. Neighbors whispered about emergency HOA board meetings, hastily called to discuss appropriate measures. Karen was rattled, but she was also doubling down, convinced that sheer force of paperwork and intimidation could still drive me out. But Karen had made a fatal mistake. She had assumed those 100 bikes were the end of the story. What she didn't realize was that they were only the beginning. The truth was, those riders hadn't appeared by chance. They came because I had called them, not all directly, but through the kind of word-of-mouth network that people like Karen could never understand. One phone call to an old friend led to 5 more, and those 5 led to 20. Veterans I'd served with, mechanics I'd trained, riders I'd once fixed bikes for. They all knew me, and more importantly, they knew my son. When word spread that a disabled kid had been targeted, harassed and threatened in his own garage, the response was immediate. Loyalty doesn't fade with time. It grows deeper. And every one of those riders who came that Sunday had shown up not because of me, but because they understood what Karen had done. She hadn't just disrespected a father. She had tried to crush the spirit of a boy who already fought battles daily. And in the biker world, in the veteran world, in any world worth living in, you don't cross that line without consequences. Daniel, for the first time, began asking questions about my past. He wanted to know about the friends who had arrived, about the history behind those leather jackets and weathered vests. He was curious about the bonds that could bring so many together so quickly. And so I told him. I told him about the nights overseas when engines were the only sound between us and danger. I told him about the men who had ridden thousands of miles to attend funerals of brothers they'd never even met, simply because loyalty demanded it. I told him how, after leaving the military, many of those men found community in motorcycle clubs, not for crime or chaos, but for belonging, for brotherhood, for the kind of family that life had sometimes denied them. Daniel listened, wide-eyed, and for the first time I saw him begin to imagine himself not as an outsider, not as the kid who couldn't ride, but as part of something larger than himself. Karen had tried to make him feel small, but now he was starting to see the opposite, that he was connected to something bigger than she could ever control. Meanwhile, Karen's tactics were getting bolder and more desperate. She was no longer satisfied with fines and rumors. She started knocking on doors, canvassing the neighborhood like a politician. She warned families that bikers would bring crime, that their children were unsafe as long as that boy was tinkering with engines. She painted pictures of drugs, violence, and lawlessness, all tied back to me and my garage. For a while, some neighbors believed her. Fear spreads quickly, and it doesn't take much for good people to fall silent when they're scared. But then something unexpected began to happen. The very riders Karen was demonizing started coming back, not in large, intimidating groups, but in 2s and 3s. They would park their bikes quietly, knock on my door, and ask if they could help Daniel with projects. One brought over a custom chrome piece for his tool tray. Another spent hours showing him how to wire a headlight assembly. They weren't loud. They weren't threatening. They were just present, kind, and patient, neighbors noticed. The same people who had once peered nervously through their blinds now saw something different. They saw bikers kneeling down to Daniel's level, handing him tools, laughing with him, treating him like one of their own. They saw kindness where Karen had promised chaos. They saw community where Karen had predicted crime. And slowly, the whispers in the neighborhood began to shift. Karen hated it. She hated that her narrative was unraveling before her eyes. She doubled her efforts, filing complaints with the city, trying to drag in local authorities. But every time she pushed, every time she tried to paint bikers as villains, the reality was right there in front of everyone's eyes. Men and women with grease-stained hands and patched jackets, taking time out of their lives to lift up a kid who'd been knocked down too many times already. One evening, Daniel asked me something I'll never forget. "Dad," he said, his voice steady, "why did Karen send those bikers here to scare me? Why would she go that far?" I thought about it for a long time before answering. The truth was, Karen's actions came down to one thing: control. She wanted to dictate every detail of the neighborhood, and she saw us as a threat to that control. We didn't fit into her perfect vision of tidy lawns and quiet streets. We represented independence, resilience, and the one thing she couldn't tolerate: freedom. But explaining all that to Daniel, I realized something else too. Karen wasn't just trying to control property lines or noise levels. She was trying to crush individuality, to make everyone bend to her will. And that was why so many people, even those outside our neighborhood, were ready to stand against her. She wasn't just my enemy anymore. She had become the enemy of everyone who valued community over control. By the end of that week, Karen was on the defensive in ways she never had been before. The HOA board was beginning to fracture. Some members, once loyal to her, were now questioning her leadership. They were tired of being dragged into her vendettas, tired of watching her weaponize the association for personal battles. I knew then that the tide was turning. Karen had wanted to intimidate us into silence, but instead she had awakened an army. She had pulled at a thread without realizing it was connected to a web too large for her to untangle. And as I looked at my son, smiling for the first time in days as he adjusted a carburetor with a biker twice his size, leaning over to guide him, I realized the real victory wasn't even about me. It was about him. Karen had tried to make him feel weak, and in doing so, she had revealed just how strong he truly was, because his strength had drawn others to him. The war wasn't over. Karen wasn't done. But for the first time, I could see her empire starting to crumble. And I knew deep down that she had no idea what was coming next, because 15 bikes had tried to scare my son. 100 had shown up to stand with him, and soon that number would be the least of Karen's worries. By the time the second weekend rolled around after Karen's biker stunt, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. The HOA notices had slowed, but not because Karen was giving up. No, she was recalibrating. She was plotting her next strike, and everyone knew it. Even the board members who once supported her were starting to avoid eye contact, their smiles tighter, their voices lower. The foundation of her empire was beginning to crack, but she was determined to plaster over every fissure with more arrogance and intimidation. For Daniel and me, the week had been one of quiet victories. Riders kept stopping by in small numbers, not to intimidate, not to escalate, but simply to help. They brought food, spare parts, and jokes that made Daniel laugh until his shoulders shook. For the first time in years, our garage wasn't just a workspace. It was a hub of community. Strangers had become friends, and friends had become brothers. But Karen wasn't blind. She saw the comings and goings, the way neighbors lingered at their driveways longer than usual to wave or nod at the riders. She saw her narrative crumbling, her warnings ignored. And in true Karen fashion, she didn't retreat. She lashed out. Late one Friday afternoon, notices went out announcing a special emergency HOA meeting to be held the next day. Attendance was mandatory. The language was sharp, accusing, dripping with barely veiled threats. Karen framed it as a meeting to restore order in the community, but everyone knew what it really was: her attempt at regaining control. I didn't plan to attend. Karen wanted a stage, and I had no interest in being her unwilling actor. But word spread quickly among the riders. They didn't like the idea of Karen using her position to rally fear against a kid in a wheelchair and his father. And when bikers decide to make a statement, they don't do it halfway. The next morning, before the meeting even began, the sound started. It was faint at first, a low vibration that rattled the windows and made coffee cups tremble on kitchen counters. Then it grew, louder and louder, until the very street seemed to shake beneath it. Engines, dozens, maybe hundreds. Daniel's eyes lit up as he sat by the garage door, his hands gripping the arms of his wheelchair. "Dad," he whispered, his voice trembling not with fear this time, but with awe. They came in waves, turning into the subdivision like a living tide. Harleys, Indians, Yamahas, machines of every make and model, polished chrome glinting in the sunlight. Riders lined up in rows so precise it looked choreographed, each engine contributing to a symphony of thunder. By the time the last bike parked, there were over 100 filling the street, their presence impossible to ignore. The neighborhood froze. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted, phones appeared at windows recording the spectacle. Parents pulled children closer, not out of fear, but out of sheer disbelief at the sight. Never before had our quiet, manicured suburb seen anything like it. And at the center of it all, directly across from our house, stood Karen. She stormed out onto her porch. Her clipboard clutched like a weapon, her sunglasses barely hiding the panic flashing in her eyes. She tried to raise her voice above the engines, shouting something about trespassing and HOA regulations, but her words were swallowed whole by the roar. The riders weren't there to talk. They weren't there to threaten. They were there to show. Engines idled in unison, a wall of sound that made Karen's voice irrelevant. The street was no longer hers to command. It belonged to the riders, to Daniel, to the community that had chosen solidarity over submission. I stepped out onto my driveway, Daniel beside me. I didn't raise my hands or gesture for silence. I didn't need to. This wasn't about speeches or declarations. It was about presence. It was about showing Karen and everyone else watching that intimidation was no longer hers to wield. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, curiosity overcoming fear. One by one, they realized what they were seeing. Not chaos, not a gang, but a coalition. Veterans with patches denoting service. Independent riders wearing jackets stitched with memories of long roads traveled. Families who had come to stand not for me, but for my son. Karen's composure cracked. She pointed at me, shouting something about unauthorized gatherings and community standards. But her voice shook, and even from across the street I could see her mask slipping. She was no longer the queen of the cul-de-sac. She was a rattled woman screaming into a storm that didn't care to hear her. Then, as if to drive the point home, one rider, a gray-bearded veteran I'd served with overseas, pulled a flag from his saddlebag. It wasn't a club banner or a symbol of rebellion. It was the American flag, frayed at the edges but still strong, still proud. He raised it high, and the riders around him revved their engines in perfect unison. The sound rolled through the neighborhood like thunder. It wasn't just noise, it was defiance, it was unity. It was the sound of 100 people saying, "Enough!" Karen stumbled back, her clipboard clattering against the porch rail. For the first time since I'd moved into that neighborhood, she looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable, just small. Of course, Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. She pulled out her phone, dialing furiously. Within minutes, the distant wail of sirens joined the chorus of engines. She thought the police would come and sweep us away, would validate her authority and silence the rebellion. But Karen didn't understand something fundamental. The law doesn't bend to clipboards and rumors, not when truth stands in plain sight. When the cruisers pulled up, lights flashing, the riders didn't scatter. They didn't run. They sat calmly on their bikes, engines humming like the steady beat of a drum line. Officers stepped out, wary but not aggressive, scanning the scene with practiced eyes. They saw no brawls, no threats, no crimes. They saw men and women sitting in solidarity, veterans displaying service patches, families standing on porches nodding in quiet approval. I walked forward slowly, Daniel rolling beside me. I handed one of the officers the binder I'd been keeping, the notices, the fines, the video footage of the 15 Hells Angels Karen had sent to intimidate us. I told him everything, not with anger but with clarity. Behind us, the riders stayed silent. Their engines spoke for them, steady and strong, filling the gaps between my words. Karen, meanwhile, shrieked from her porch. She accused me of harassment, accused the riders of being criminals, accused the police of being incompetent for not arresting us on the spot. She waved her clipboard like it was a badge, demanding obedience, demanding control, but the officers didn't take her side. They didn't see a victim. They saw a bully whose power was unraveling in real time. And as they walked past her porch to inspect the evidence I'd given them, I knew the tide had fully turned. The showdown Karen had orchestrated wasn't going her way. Her intimidation had backfired spectacularly. She had tried to weaponize fear, but instead, she had united a community against her. And as the police spoke quietly with me, as neighbors crept closer to see what was happening, as engines hummed like a wall of protection behind us, I realized that Karen's empire wasn't just cracking anymore. It was collapsing. The storm had arrived, and Karen was standing directly in its path. The neighborhood was never quiet after that Saturday. Not in the same way. The roar of those 100 bikes faded eventually, the riders peeling away one by one as the police kept watch and neighbors whispered from their lawns. But even when the last tail light disappeared into the distance, the silence that followed wasn't the old silence, the fearful hush Karen used to command. This silence was charged, unsettled, waiting for the next move. Karen had built her power on intimidation. Fines, notices, gossip, and threats, all tools she'd wielded with precision. But intimidation is only effective so long as people believe in it. The moment her mask cracked, the moment people saw her shrieking on her porch while 100 riders stood tall in defiance, her spell broke. And when an HOA president loses control of the narrative, the downfall is inevitable. The police didn't arrest anyone that day. They spoke to me, listened carefully as I laid out the months of harassment and the stunt she'd pulled with the Hells Angels. They took copies of the footage, the paperwork, the stack of fines she'd plastered across my door. When they finally turned to Karen, they weren't deferential like she expected. They weren't nodding and agreeing the way board members had done for years. They were skeptical. Their pens scribbled notes as she ranted, her voice growing shriller, her accusations wilder. That night, the neighborhood was buzzing. Phones rang, group texts flew, and whispers carried from porch to porch. The image of Karen losing control, shouting into a storm of engines, was burned into everyone's minds. Some neighbors laughed quietly, others shook their heads, but all agreed on one thing. Karen wasn't invincible anymore. Over the next few days, the shift became obvious. People who once kept their heads down started speaking up. At the mailboxes, in driveways, on evening walks, they asked me questions. They wanted to know what was really going on, what Karen had done, why riders had shown up in such force. When I told them about the 15 Hells Angels she'd sent to scare Daniel, their faces hardened. Parents especially reacted with disgust because it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a disabled kid being targeted. Karen sensed the shift too, and she doubled down. More fines appeared in my mailbox, each more absurd than the last. One cited Daniel's wheelchair ramp for being unsightly. Another claimed the shade of blue on our mailbox wasn't within HOA-approved tones, even though it was the same one the builders had installed. The fines stacked up to nearly $10,000 in a week, numbers so inflated they were laughable, if not for the stress they brought. But instead of isolating me, Karen's escalation backfired. Neighbors who had once quietly endured her petty fines started coming forward with their own stories. A retired couple down the street revealed she'd fined them for keeping a small herb garden on their patio. A young family admitted she'd tried to block them from building a wheelchair ramp for their visiting grandmother. Each story painted the same picture. Karen wasn't a leader. She was a tyrant. By midweek, copies of those stories were making their way around the neighborhood Facebook group. Screenshots of Karen's notices, side by side with photos of perfectly normal yards and homes, spread like wildfire. And for once, Karen couldn't control the narrative. Her comments denying everything only made her look worse. The HOA board tried to stay neutral at first, but the cracks in their loyalty showed. Two members privately reached out to me, apologizing for their silence. They admitted they'd been bullied into compliance, threatened with fines of their own if they didn't back her decisions. One of them even confessed that Karen had been funneling HOA funds into special projects that conveniently never materialized. That was the opening I needed. I gathered every document, every notice, every witness statement, and I started building a case. Not just for the police, but for the community. Karen had ruled through secrecy, but if the truth was dragged into daylight, her throne would crumble. Meanwhile, Daniel watched everything with wide, careful eyes. He saw the riders checking in, the neighbors stopping by, the papers piling higher on the kitchen counter. One night, as I was sorting through the stack of evidence, he wheeled up beside me and placed his hand on mine. "You're winning, Dad," he said softly. She's scared. He wasn't wrong. Karen's behavior grew more erratic by the day. She patrolled the neighborhood in her golf cart, scribbling notes furiously, glaring at anyone who dared wave at the riders who still stopped by our house. She left voicemail after voicemail for board members, demanding loyalty, threatening consequences if they didn't restore order. But the more she raged, the less they listened. Fear had shifted sides. The real turning point came at the next board meeting. Normally, those gatherings were dull affairs. Karen running the show, neighbors too scared to speak up, decisions made behind closed doors. But that night the room was packed. Word had spread, and nearly every homeowner showed up. Some came with folders of their own fines, others with photos of violations that were laughably petty. And sitting quietly in the back row were a handful of riders, not in leather this time, but in plain clothes, there to support me and Daniel as neighbors. Not outsiders. Karen tried to open the meeting as usual, banging her gavel and launching into a lecture about community standards. But the room didn't bend to her will anymore. Voices rose. People interrupted. Neighbors who had been silent for years now stood and read their notices aloud, the absurdity echoing through the room. Laughter broke out at her claims, and for the first time, Karen's gavel wasn't enough to silence them. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't shout. I didn't accuse. I simply laid out the facts, the harassment, the bikers she'd sent to intimidate Daniel, the police report, the stack of fines. I held up each document, each piece of evidence, and placed them on the table one by one. And as I did, the room shifted. Eyes that once darted nervously toward Karen now locked on me with steady focus. By the time I finished, Karen's face was crimson. She ranted about conspiracies, about outsiders trying to destroy the neighborhood, about criminal elements infiltrating the board. But no one bought it. Not anymore. The board voted that night to launch an internal audit of the HOA's finances. Karen stormed out before the vote was even finalized, her threats echoing down the hall. But the damage was done. The cracks in her throne were now wide enough for everyone to see. Back home, as Daniel and I sat on the porch, the hum of a single bike echoed down the street. It wasn't a show of force this time. It was a friend stopping by, a reminder that we weren't alone. And as the rider waved and parked beside us, I realized something important. This wasn't just about fighting Karen anymore. It was about rebuilding a community she had nearly destroyed. Karen still had power, still had claws, but the tide had turned. She was losing ground fast, and the more desperately she tried to cling to control, the more obvious her downfall became. The queen of the cul-de-sac was cracking, and soon her empire would collapse entirely. The audit began quietly, but in a neighborhood like ours, nothing stays quiet for long. Karen had ruled with fear and secrecy for so many years that people had almost forgotten what transparency felt like. But once the board voted to dig into the HOA's books, the whispers started. Every neighbor who had been fined, every family who had been bullied, every homeowner who had written checks with no explanation, they all wanted to know the same thing. Where had the money gone? Karen, of course, insisted the audit was a witch hunt. She plastered the neighborhood with flyers claiming criminal outsiders were manipulating the board. She called emergency meetings that no one attended. She left furious voicemails on board members' phones, threatening legal action if they didn't protect the integrity of the HOA. But fear no longer worked. The board ignored her demands, neighbors stopped listening, and her voice became little more than background noise. As the auditors combed through the records, the truth began to surface. HOA funds were missing, tens of thousands of dollars redirected into accounts that had nothing to do with landscaping or repairs. Consulting fees had been paid to companies that didn't exist. Community projects had invoices but no results. It was a paper trail of corruption, carefully hidden behind jargon and numbers, but undeniable once exposed. When the board released its preliminary findings, the neighborhood erupted. People gathered in driveways, shaking their heads, passing copies of the report like contraband. Karen hadn't just abused her authority, she'd stolen from us. Every fine, every threat, every notice had been part of a scheme to pad her own pockets. And still, she refused to yield. Karen showed up at the next board meeting with a lawyer in tow, a sharp-suited man who clearly didn't understand what he'd walked into. She sat at the head of the table, chin lifted high, sunglasses perched on her nose as if the room full of glaring neighbors didn't exist. She tried to frame the audit as biased, claimed the missing funds were misunderstandings, accused anyone who questioned her of being part of a conspiracy. But this time, the board didn't fold. They read the numbers aloud, line by line, each one a nail in the coffin of her presidency. Neighbors stood up, waving their own records, their own receipts. Every lie she spun unraveled in real time. The web she'd built collapsing under the weight of the truth. Then came the final blow. The auditors revealed that Karen had used HOA funds to pay off the very bikers she'd unleashed on Daniel. The Hells Angels hadn't shown up out of personal loyalty to her. They'd been bought, their visit paid for with our community's money. The room fell silent at that revelation. Even her lawyer's pen froze mid-scribble. Karen's defense crumbled in an instant. For a moment, Karen just sat there, her mask finally gone. No shrieking, no gavel, no clipboard armor, just a woman cornered by her own greed. She rose abruptly, knocked over her chair, and stormed out without a word. Her lawyer scrambled after her, but the damage was irreversible. The board voted that night to remove her from her position permanently. Letters went out to every homeowner confirming her expulsion and announcing a criminal investigation into the missing funds. For the first time in years, Karen Mitchell no longer controlled the neighborhood. Her fall was swift after that. The police came knocking within a week. Neighbors watched from their porches as squad cars pulled up to her house, officers escorting her out in handcuffs while her golf cart sat abandoned in the driveway. Phones recorded every second. The once untouchable queen reduced to a headline waiting to happen. Within hours, the footage was online, and by morning, the world knew the story. An HOA president who had abused her power, stolen from her community, and been brought down not by silence, but by resistance. The neighborhood changed after her arrest. The fear lifted, replaced by something we hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. The new board, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak, opened the books, held meetings in the open, and rolled back the mountain of absurd fines. Instead of Karen's golf cart circling like a vulture, kids rode their bikes freely, families planted gardens without fear, and Daniel's ramp stood untouched, a symbol of what we'd fought for. As for the riders, they didn't disappear when Karen did. They still came by, not in overwhelming numbers, but in steady streams of friendship. Some stopped to share meals, others to help with repairs, others just to check on Daniel. The garage remained a hub, but now it was filled with laughter instead of tension. Chrome still gleamed in the sunlight, but now it was joined by the chatter of neighbors who had once been strangers. Daniel thrived in the new calm. He rolled outside more, his laughter carrying down the street without the shadow of Karen's clipboard looming nearby. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the last of the riders rumbled off down the street, he turned to me with a smile that reached his eyes. "She can't scare us anymore, Dad," he said, and he was right. Karen had tried to break us with fear. She had sent bikers to intimidate a disabled kid, weaponized fines to bleed families dry, and stolen from the very people she claimed to represent. But in the end, her downfall wasn't about bikers or board meetings or audits. It was about community. It was about neighbors refusing to be silenced. about strangers coming together to protect one another, about a father and son who chose to stand instead of bow. The day she was led away in handcuffs, Karen lost more than her title. She lost the illusion of power she had clung to so desperately, and in her absence, something far stronger grew: unity. The roar of 100 bikes had shaken the street once, but the echo of what they stood for would linger far longer. And every time Daniel laughed in the open air, every time a neighbor waved without fear, every time the sun set over a community no longer chained to tyranny, it reminded me of one truth: no bully, no matter how loud, can outlast the strength of people who refuse to be broken. Karen thought she ruled a kingdom, but in the end she built her own prison. And that's how one HOA president's empire crumbled, because she picked a fight with the wrong family, underestimated a disabled kid's strength, and thought fear could hold a community together. In the end, her clipboard, fines, and intimidation were no match for truth, unity, and the roar of 100 bikes. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you never miss another wild HOA or Karen drama. Share this video with a friend who loves justice served hot, and drop a comment below. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Thanks for watching, and remember, in the end, bullies always fall.